being recorded.
With over 40 years experience working on money laundering issues from a regulatory and from a bank economic development perspective across the Middle East, Africa, and North Africa. And so, James brings a wealth of experience to this conversation. So this will be an introduction to money laundering. We will have a chance to ask questions of James, but I'll be quiet now and allow James to run to go through his presentation, which will take about 25 minutes to 30 minutes. If you have questions as he goes on, please put them in the chat box just right here. Once his presentation is over, there will be a chance to ask questions verbally, which is when you unmute yourselves. But during the presentation, you can put your questions in the chat box and we'll take them once this is done. So I will hand over to James now, and I hope that we all don't have any technical problems. Please, if we do, text us, put it in the chat box while James is going to start his presentation. So over to you, James.
Thank you, Lola, for that nice introduction. I'm especially happy to make this presentation today because I have worked in Africa. And also, I've taken a keen interest in economics in Africa, particularly in some areas, specialties like correspondent banking. So it certainly is a pleasure to make this presentation. Unfortunately, many times when we have a mixed audience, presentations include basic concepts. So for those of you who have seen some of this material before, I apologize. But we are going to probably briefly go through the basics in order to get into some of the more detailed, complex issues, and also, more importantly, leave some time to talk about those money laundering issues that are pertaining specifically to Africa. So let's look at our first slide. Okay, we could. All right, this is just a general definition of money laundering. There are quite a few different ones, but I wanted to point out a couple of things about the definition. First of all, concealment is the major issue here. Many of these schemes are initially designed to conceal. Quite often, the money laundering scheme uses a complex sequence of movements of funds or activities. But finally, the whole intent and purpose is to return those assets or funds to the criminal. Quite often, the money laundering is undertaken by those assisting the criminals. Other times, criminals will conduct the money laundering themselves. So let's take a close look at some other areas of the money laundering issue. Why launder money? Or, of course, the criminal wants to evade the attention of law enforcement. And in many countries, there's a level of knowledge, technical knowledge of money laundering at both the investigative level, the prosecution level, and the judges as well. But unfortunately, these are areas where additional training is required, and we'll get into that. Okay, these are the associated crimes, that what we consider to be the predicate offense. And if we look carefully, I'm sure someone will think of a different kind of crime that's not listed here. Last night, I saw that we forgot to include illegal gambling. So many of us can probably come up with some additional crimes, but these are the predicate crimes. So those criminals committing these crimes resort to money laundering schemes in order to make their illicit gains appear to be legal. Okay. All right, there are three processes. It's not the case all the time. Many times there are only just two processes, but we'll just briefly look at them: placement, layering, and integration. These are the processes. Now we'll take a little closer look. Let's look at placement. This is essentially where the criminal proceeds to move their money into the financial system. We're not just talking about banks here. We're talking about casinos, insurance companies, securities companies, money service businesses as well. And in the area of money laundering, that term of financial institution is extremely broad. Okay. In terms of layering, this is where you see a complex list of schemes where you're essentially using a number of different techniques, moving between bank accounts, moving from one person's bank account or one corporate bank account to another, quite often transferring the funds by way of wire transfers from bank to bank, and then quite often movement through a series of shell companies. And we're going to look closely at an example, and I'll explain further what I mean about these shell companies and where the movement of funds is going. Okay, now integration is at the last stage, and this is where after a number of complex processes, the funds appear to look legitimate, whereupon the criminal, through money laundering assistance, will purchase luxury assets, automobiles, real estate, or they may take the funds and move it back into their own illegal operations or businesses that they may purchase to use for front companies especially. Okay, this is a typical money laundering scheme. It doesn't include the detail, but you can see the first step is the placement into a bank, or it could be a money service business, or it could be a securities firm. And the second stage is the layering, where you could have a combination of moving from bank to bank, country to country, and also through a series of shell companies. It's not uncommon to see a half a dozen different shell companies, A, B, C, D, E, F. And then finally, the last stage would move again through a bank and out, and at that time the criminal will purchase the luxury assets, or they may move the money back into their operations. Okay, there are a number of different ways that you can launder money. You can do it through institutions. You can use professionals, accountants. You can also use private individuals that are expert money launderers. Again, there's usually about a 5 or 10% cost to the criminal to have their funds laundered. And this is not an exhaustive list of the kinds of entities and professionals that are involved in money laundering. I want to point out in particular this area where we're looking at importers and exporters, because many of us know that trade-based money laundering is the most difficult area for law enforcement to understand the scheme or recognize whether or not it's money laundering or not. So in the future, we're probably going to see more countries looking at importers and exporters as perhaps a group to report. Now, in terms of reporting, what does this mean? These are the particular industries and individuals that countries who have money laundering laws require them to report suspicious activities to a particular entity. Usually countries will have financial intelligence units where those reports will be sent, usually called suspicious activity reports. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about those FIUs, because most countries in Africa do have those specialized law enforcement units. Okay, the adverse impacts to money laundering are not always well known. Most people realize that this money laundering scheme is facilitating criminal activity, but it does have a lot of major impacts, particularly economic impacts. It's obvious to business people that there's an anti-competition to play here, because money launderers use many companies as front. They're not concerned about the real profit of that companies, and this creates major problems for those businesses that are on the up and up legal. They can't compete against these companies that are owned by money launderers. But there are more deeper economic impacts. First of all, if you're looking at the economic picture of a country, the government economists and experts are looking at money flows, and the money that is being laundered presents a major problem for these studies, and it's difficult to predict and plan based on these economic factors. the local investment is a real major problem in terms of taking a hit for money laundering, because when criminals are laundering money, they're taking money out of the economy that could be extremely productive to produce jobs. In fact, there are studies that can identify in each country how many new jobs could have been established if the amount of money laundering was reduced. Another important factor, and I think we'll probably expand on this a little bit later on, is that it impacts foreign investment. Many companies, many countries look at different countries' risk, and they may be averse to providing investment in those countries. So a proactive regime in terms of anti-money laundering is going to improve the image of that country in the eyes of these businesses. Again, most importantly, funds that are laundered often leave the country, and perhaps there's a raid on the treasury, and these funds are needed to provide for health, education, and welfare in a country. So we're taking away from a major area or areas that need to be addressed and need to make the wherewithal for countries to thrive. Okay, generally, the major recommendations that are made by international groups such as FATF and other experts is, first of all, countries must enact strong anti-money laundering laws. Second, they must demonstrate that they can prosecute criminals for money laundering, and this is a real important measure. And more international organizations are not only looking at the strength of the laws, but the real activity in terms of, is it producing the results that we want to see. And again, the establishment of financial intelligence units is extremely important because of the need for more knowledge and sophistication and understanding money laundering, and to work with those reporting entities. So these units, I'll go into a little detail later on, but they're units set up in the government. They're experts. They can recognize money laundering, and they can work with law enforcement. Again, another important aspect of a money laundering law would be to regulate transactions, entities, and professionals, and that's not only providing guidance, but requiring them to take specific action, whether it's reporting money laundering or whether it's maintaining good compliance programs. Okay, these financial intelligence units, I think most, if not all, countries in Africa have them. They're set up. Sometimes they'll report to the president, sometimes they'll report to the Congress, but they're experts and they perform three functions. They receive reports from those reporting entities, and the reporting entities would be submitting a report if they believe there's a possibility of money laundering. So the reports are sent usually electronically to the unit, and the unit usually has experts in different fields, different areas, banking, securities, casinos, etc. And then these reports are analyzed to determine, well, is this really money laundering? And unfortunately, many times it's not, but someone needs to take a close look at it. In the United States, I believe only 4% of the reports are actually determined to be money laundering. And of course, the FIU is extremely important in providing guidance in terms of technical knowledge of how money's laundered and what the red flags are in terms of identifying money laundering. So they're important units. And there is an international organization called Egmont that coordinates and supports financial intelligence units around the world. There are other regulatory functions, particularly agencies that regulate the reporting entities, banking authorities, gaming authorities, etc. I think they do, from the specific area of resources, can do a good job. Sometimes if the resources are not provided, they cannot do a good job in terms of providing guidance. But let's take a look at, on the banking side, they have a function of inspecting banks for whether or not these banks are reporting money laundering, and do they have a good compliance plan that is providing best practices in their particular institution. Many of these agencies can take legal action. Usually it's in the form of fines. When we're talking about bringing people to prison, they coordinate with the law enforcement authorities to bring that about. So there's basically two most important functions of these reporting entities, whether they be banks, casinos, money service businesses, or such. The first is they should be reporting money laundering to the FIU, or in some countries it would be law enforcement authorities sending these reports. So they have to be looking at their operations. To effectively carry out this function, they have to have sophisticated compliance programs. Okay, and these are generally speaking what is called for in a particular reporting entity's operations. A compliance officer that's knowledgeable of the industry itself and anti-money laundering, training for the personnel, particularly in what the policies and procedures are in the institution or the company, and the employees need to know that. They need to draft tight policies and procedures, and they need to have checks such as internal auditing and testing. And I'll talk a little bit about the internal auditing. This is another type of audit in an institution that focuses exclusively on compliance with anti-money laundering laws. Testing takes place with respect to bank examiners. There's a special program where they go into banks and they perform a anti-money laundering examination. And in doing so, they will do two things. They'll look at the profile of the customer. Is enough information being provided on these customers? Enhanced due diligence for high-risk customers versus ordinary customers. And then they'll look at transactions, whether they're loans or account activity or wire transfers. Another important area, of course, is for institutions to know their risk and have a risk-based system in place so that they effectively use their resources. In order to do this, they must undertake an assessment of the risk, whether it's customer risk, whether it's transaction risk, or a risk emanating from a particular geographic area. Okay, now we're going to talk about some very important issues. The first, of course, is Know Your Customer program. For all institutions, it's important for these institutions to understand well their customer in order to measure the risk, and also in order to determine whether certain activities by these customers are normal or abnormal for their profile. This is a sticky point in most institutions in most countries, because you get tremendous pushback from customers when they're being asked detailed programs. And unfortunately, there's a condition in many countries where you have good institutions with good Know Your Customer policies, and then you have institutions with weak Know Your Customer policies. And in those cases, many times customers will move from the institution with a strong program to one with a weak program. And the answer to this problem is that the government itself, in regulations and overseeing, must provide a level playing field when it comes to good performance under Know Your Customer. Another important tool is good beneficial ownership information, the ability to provide or to obtain this from customers. And of course, why this is important? Well, money launderers tend to keep this kind of information from the institutions, and that's why internationally they're trying to promote more standards for the type of detailed information that needs to be provided to banks and other institutions in terms of showing who the true beneficial owner is of the asset. Okay, another important tool is to have a good program for identifying politically exposed persons. And again, this is a general definition for politically exposed persons, but what you want to keep in mind in this area is that politically exposed persons are not inclusive of the actual person, but also should be covered with respect to relatives. And I know there have been some very interesting cases in Africa. Muhammad al-Bachi, son of a previous dictator. There's another case, Isabel Dos Santos, another daughter of a dictator. So these are high-profile money laundering cases, but it demonstrates the need to broaden the term or the definition of politically exposed persons to relatives as well. And I know in a lot of cases in the United States, we've been able to uncover daughters, sons or daughters, or other relatives to politically exposed persons in other countries. So there's some other important things that can be done. First of all, the training of investigators, prosecutors, and judges. And in working in the many countries that I've been working in, I've found that this particular training is sorely lacking. It's in line with a lot of other issues in terms of investigators, prosecutors, and judges, and that they are not properly reimbursed for the work that they do. So training in terms of how money laundering cases can be investigated, how they can be prosecuted. This kind of training can come from other countries, private organizations, but it's extremely important. I've had examples shown to me in countries where judges have done a very poor job and cases have been lost. And one of the reasons is generally, sometimes, unfortunately, judges lacking information receive this particular case. In other times, judges don't feel confident enough to handle the case. They avoid the case. So I've had countries where the judges, prosecutors are not from the government, but they're on a contract basis, which is kind of suspected. But different laws in different countries are from time to time stronger or weaker to what we're recommending. Another important area is training for the reporting entities. Reporting entities need training in two areas. They need to be able to identify red flags in their particular industry. And for each of those 15 reporting entities that I presented, there's a whole host of red flags that go along with the kinds of money laundering that will take place via a casino or a money service business or an insurance company or a bank. So they need to A, be able to recognize the red flags, and B, they must know what the best practice is internally for running an anti-money laundering program in their institution. One of the most important private organizations located in the United States, of course, is ACAMS, Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists, where training is given to members and they are certified, and they do a tremendous amount of good work in other countries, particularly encouraging those people in the field to get their professional certification, because it's an ongoing learning experience belonging to this organization, because they learn more and more about what the latest trends are in money laundering, as well as what the best practices that can be used in their institution. Okay, in terms of resources, there are a large number of resources. I had mentioned briefly the Financial Action Task Force. This is an international body that sets standards. It's made up of the G7 countries. I believe that's France, Germany, Italy, Japan, UK, United States, and they set the standards, and they provide two functions: setting standards for best practices, and two, they evaluate countries for how effective the particular AML regime is in that country. And when they find that it is not up to par, then they will in fact provide detailed reports of what this particular country needs to do to come up to standards. And this is called a mutual evaluation, sometimes conducted by FATF itself and sometimes conducted by regional FATF bodies. Some of the other organizations that provide funding and resources is the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF. I've worked for both World Bank, IMF, and in terms of assistance, they will come in and they'll train not only banks, insurance companies, securities firms, casinos, to not only provide that kind of training, but they'll also ensure that different institutions are following the procedures. From time to time, these people can actually go on bank examinations. So these particular organizations are strong resources that you want to bring into your country to provide this kind of training in terms of best practices for the reporting entities and also the training for the judges and the prosecutors and investigators. So these resources are used. I think it's important to point out, earlier I talked about FATF and the members of FATF. Well, these essentially are not Asian or African countries. So a major objective is to understand those kinds of money laundering schemes that are taking place in those countries and what the best practice is. So in order for this to take place and really have important information to provide for good anti-money laundering programs is to have bodies in those regions. So FATF has set up specific regional bodies in Asia, in South America, and in Africa. There are three leading groups, and it's the Middle East and North African Financial Action Task Force, the Intergovernmental Action Group Against Money Laundering in West Africa, and Eastern and Southern Africa. So these groups are important from two perspectives. They'll provide assistance to countries, but they also will provide something extremely unique. They will study the unique typologies of that particular region of the country. In other words, the kinds of money laundering that is going on, to be alert to. And these are some of the, I received this information by looking at some of the reports that these bodies put out. They do a tremendous amount of research, tremendous amount of technical assistance, and these are some of the areas that they're focusing on. And many of these areas are unique to Africa. I'm talking about wildlife, mining, and corruption. I'm sure there's some other areas as well, but this is generally what I've been able to take from looking at a lot of the work of the FATF-style regional bodies. Okay, there's a very important area, and that is in talking about reporting entities that are required by law to report to the FIU and other law enforcement. There are a whole host of other industries out there, and they want to know what they can do. I had a recent request, I guess it was about a year ago, from an international building association, and the question was raised, and this question was raised by Lola. I thought it was an extremely important question, so I expanded my presentation. The question was raised, well, that's fine with the reporting agencies, but what as an average business should we be doing? And the answer is, first of all, if you suspect money laundering, you should also be reporting voluntarily. But there's another exercise that can be important to your business, and that is undertaking an assessment of the risks from money laundering in your particular company. And it follows three different elements in terms of the operation of your company. First is assessment is you need to look at the kinds of products and services that you're involved in your country, in your company. Some of them are low risk products and services, others are high risk. And if you're selling a high risk product, then that's where you want to focus your specific emphasis when looking at assessing risk. The second area to look at it from the viewpoint of a customer base, what kind of customers do you have? Do you have a lot of customers in a particular area that's high risk? Do you have certain kinds of customers, low risk? Long-term customers, short-term customers, how are the customers introduced? Are you able to meet with them in person, or are these referrals, telephone calls, etc.? So the degree in which your relationship is with this customer can determine the risk for money laundering. And then again, there's geographic risk. And this particular risk is not only focused on risky areas of your country, but what are the high-risk countries around the world that you have to be able to recognize should you have a contractual relationship with a new customer. A lot of this information is on the internet. You can go to a number of sources. One source is Know Your Country, where it rates from an anti-money laundering standpoint. It will rate the status of the country. There's other work that's done in the United States by the State Department. It's an INSER report that's done annually on each country. And there's a number of other private groups that rate countries not only from anti-money laundering standpoint, but from a fraud standpoint too. So if you're a non-reporting entity and you want to do something in terms of understanding your money laundering risk, this is the kind of approach to take. It can be a very detailed risk assessment where you may want to employ a consultant, or you could undertake it in-house as well. In terms of opportunities, I know we have a lot of entrepreneurs on the line. I think there are a lot of opportunities in this area. One is businesses that want to do internal audits for these companies. Another area is in performing these assessments. A third very important area that businesses want to consider in terms of expanding what the opportunity could be in the anti-money laundering area is providing this specific training to each reporting entity in your country. Okay, before we get into questions and answers, I think I'm running about 4 minutes ahead. I'm going to talk about two areas, and the first area is with respect to trade. As I said initially, I am interested in economics in Africa, and there is a major issue when it comes to correspondent banking, not only in Africa, but in many, many other countries where over the past 5 or 6 years, the de-risking process has reduced the number of corresponding relationships between banks around the world. Specifically, correspondent banking is a set of services that are provided by one large international bank to smaller banks that want to facilitate trade. And the major service, of course, is the wire transfer system facilitating trade. But there are a whole host of other services that can be provided by the bank. The large international bank can work in lending and trade financing. Trade financing is the most important area, as I said. Perhaps another important factor is that looking at Africa, again, from the standpoint of demand for trade financing, they have the highest demand with the lowest satisfaction of demand. So that tells you that Africa should be trying to do more about strengthening these corresponding accounts and countering de-risking. The major way to do that is for banks to have a strong AML program, demonstrate to the international banks that they're in a strong position, they know what they're doing, they have good professionals working in the field, they have good programs, and that's when banks will look favorably upon banks, some banks in Africa that perhaps have lost their correspondent banking. But it's a big area for assistance to these banks in strengthening their AML programs, because banks generally look at risk. Many times people working in these correspondent banking areas have told me if they're not sure about the risk in a particular country or a particular institution, they'll move on and they'll curtail that banking relationship. So I think we're ready for questions and answers now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jane. That was very insightful. We have our first question in the chat box. I also had a question. I think I'll lump it up with this question from Kathy. So we'll just start with this first question, and we will take more questions. So the first one is, this topic is particularly interesting and relevant to us and CIPE's work. There are different internal control policies that we advocate for our businesses to adopt to mitigate these risks. What actions can businesses take, or what policies can they incorporate in their businesses more specifically? So this is asking about businesses. I think this might not relate specifically to reporting entities, more broadly, about corporates. What specific corporate policy should they have to mitigate the risk of money laundering, or to mitigate the risk that their companies can be used as a conduit for laundering illicit financial flows?
Well, very much like the reporting entities. Okay. I think there's more information regarding the question.
Yeah, okay. So I just want to clarify my question. I sent it out when you were talking about the slides on like several different risks of money laundering and what businesses could do. And basically my question is a follow-up to that slide, because you say, oh, the business can, do more to, there could be geographic risk, there could be different products and services they provide. So basically my question was just to, would like you to elaborate what specific type of policies or internal control procedures that the private sectors that we work with, they can adopt or incorporate to mitigate the risk of potentially money laundering.
Okay, I'll give you a good example. In a particular company, there needs to be a person designated that will handle these risks that the other employees can go to when they see something. Another important aspect is to elevate the decision making when a particular risky product or a risky customer is being dealt with.
All guests have been unmuted. All guests have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6. All guests have been unmuted.
The company to a higher level manager. There is another area too, and that is probably research on the kinds.
That answer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, do you mind repeating that?
I think we have everyone unmuted, so we're just going to hit mute for everyone. And
all guests have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6.
And kindly repeat the answer because we missed it. Thank you.
Okay, from one respect to decision making, when a particular member of the organization believes that they're dealing with a high-risk customer, or the customer's from a high-risk area, or in terms of the transaction with respect to the product and services is high risk, you need to have a place to elevate the decision-making much higher up the chain of command. That's important. Another important area is to obtain more information on the unique risks, money laundering risks, that are associated with your kind of business. That's important. You need to do research. You need to find professionals, consultants who understand your industry and can help you understand not only what is high risk and low risk, but what the appropriate action is that needs to be taken within your organization. Much of this information is on the internet in terms of understanding how your company can be used for money laundering.
Thank you, James. I had a question about red flags, and that I think it's a good segue from what you just talked about, which is how to conduct risk assessments, or the importance of conducting risk assessments to prepared to, mitigate the risk of money laundering in companies. Our partners are very familiar with how to conduct a corruption risk assessment, in the context of, business integrity and business ethics. The risk assessment that we do, we identify red flags that are connected with corrupt activity. With regards to money laundering, that already has some predicate offenses, and then money laundering itself is a separate offense. What red flags would you say, are some of the common ones that you see across industries and across sectors that, companies can look at, can use as a guide when they're conducting a, money laundering risk assessment, or a risk assessment for, the risk of money laundering in businesses? What are some of the top red flags that you'd that's common across industries that you'd say we can include in our risk assessment methodology?
When I first began doing consulting work overseas, I was amazed at how employees in different institutions, just by the very nature of their work, could identify the red flags, particularly in, say, in a bank, where many times I would sit next to a banker who's handling wire transfers, and their technical knowledge from working that particular part of the bank, they could understand, for example, oh, this is used machinery, highly suspect, or others. So there's an institutional education, so to speak. On the other hand, there are a number of different kinds of red flags that have to be identified for institutions through education. I'll give you an example. There are red flags in banks where a customer is established in a bank and a profile is developed on this customer, and then over a period of time you see that the customer is not conducting those financial transactions that are in line with what the profile said. In other words, this customer is using more service of the bank, the amount of money, etc. So there's a red flag right away. In the real estate area, if you're looking at money laundering, there are red flags: A, a foreign buyer, or B, someone who has no intention of living in the particular residence, or a straw buyer, that the real owner of the property is not being shown in the records or the closings. In casinos, for example, casinos, they're extremely good about looking at red flags from a gambling standpoint, from their operations standpoint. These folks are pros, but they'll recognize someone just coming in, playing a little bit with cash, and then turning around, turning their chips in and getting a check from the casino. Another area is insurance. Customers coming into insurance companies to purchase a certain amount of insurance for a particular area, and they have no particular background with a need for that kind of insurance. And then after obtaining the policy, they'll turn around and turn in the policy to get the assets, and they've essentially cleaned the funds. So those are some of the examples. But again, as I said, on the internet, you can find a whole host. I think for wire transfers, I must have seen 30 or 40 different red flags when people are looking at wire transfers. In the real estate industry, there's about a dozen or so red flags when you're a real estate company and you're dealing with different clients. You can see these red flags in the transactions. The same in the securities industry. They have it down to a science. In insurance and securities, the kinds of products that are being sold to the individuals, if there's not a clear reason for them to be purchasing those products, well, there's a red flag. So those are kinds, but you can find these for each of those. I had 15 reporting entities. For each one of those, there's a whole host of these red flags that you can find on the internet. And many of the training sessions that take place, for example, let's say World Bank wanted to do some training for insurance companies, or they want to do some training for securities, money service business especially, they will have a whole host of these red flags that they can present to the industry folks so that they can be alert. So education and red flags are important. The other area to be knowledgeable of is the actual ways in which the money laundering is taking place, the typologies. So there's an equal number of typologies out there that you can find on the internet. The Egmont Group routinely every year, I think FATF does this as well, they host different conferences where new technology, new typologies are presented to the group, and they'll select ones from different countries that they find are important for us to know about the latest, and whether it's virtual currencies or trade-based money laundering or something else, these new typologies. So everyone has to keep up to date on typologies. One very important aspect in a country is when institutions as a group get together and talk about the typologies. They may have one bank that sees a certain typology, and they'll get together with other banks. Compliance officers very often will have regular meetings to talk about what the latest kind of typology is that's being perpetrated in that particular area of the country.
Great. We have a question. We have a few good questions, and we have time, so I'll take the next one. The next one asks if you can elaborate on risk assessment as it relates to the three areas you already just talked about. And this question was by Kunle. So he's asking if you could give examples of how to conduct a risk assessment or what the red flags are for these three areas, which you already talked about. So I'll allow Kunle to clarify if that's what this question is about. Kunle, if you want to unmute yourself and clarify if your question is what Jim just talked about, please do that. I'll give you 30 seconds if you can unmute yourself, but if you can, put it in the chat box while I go on to the next question. Can you unmute yourself? I know you had audio issues a minute ago, which just got fixed. Okay, we'll go on to the next question and come back to this one, if you can. The next question is from Anthony from Standard Chartered Bank. And Anthony asks if you could kindly briefly elaborate on the top most common money laundering schemes in Africa.
That's a little bit of a difficult question. I think the trade-based money laundering is extremely active in Africa, and that's whereby, I'll explain it a little more carefully. This is where a whole host of different techniques are used by the money launderer in terms of using trade financing, whether it's a over and under invoicing of products and services, or misclassifying the kinds of goods that are being shipped. This is a big area. Another one of the first virtual currency money laundering schemes I saw about 4 or 5 years ago in terms of presentations was where trade-based money laundering was combined with virtual currency money laundering scheme, and that's a pretty. I think the real estate is also important. Many times when I was researching real estate, I was thinking in terms of the big countries around the world, but more and more recently looking at Africa in terms of certain areas. Let's, for instance, Nairobi, Kenya, big real estate area for money launderers, so in country as well as, real estate investments outside of countries. Those are important. So with respect to Africa, we trained some at George Mason University. We trained some government officials from Tanzania that wanted to get specific education in the anti-money laundering area. So, wildlife, the area of wildlife poaching, that's the extremely area. But finally, one of the most important areas, and I don't think there's a lot published on this, is the mining. That money laundering through mining, and that probably. So look at corruption, wildlife, and mining in Africa. Those three areas are probably, I would say, the biggest from what I've seen. Real estate too, because there are a lot of one would have expected that most of the real estate investment is from corrupt politicians and the purchase outside of the country. That's not so. There's a lot of real estate that's purchased within the country as well. Trade-based money laundering is something to watch. I think you're going to see a lot more information on trade-based money laundering. It's an extremely difficult area for those people who are investigating trade-based money laundering, because it involves so many transactions and so much paperwork. Environmental specialists in the bank don't understand the people who are handling trade financing, so it makes it difficult for them to identify it. So trade-based money laundering. And we at George Mason University just finished a major conference, and anyone who's interested in getting the conference proceedings, we can provide that to you, which goes into all of the issues of trade-based money laundering and what needs to be done around the world to stop it.
Great. Great. So we have one more question, and this is from Kunle again. Kunle is one of our very active trainers in Nigeria with the Institute of Directors Center for Corporate Governance. And Kunle says, where do you start off in an economy that has no law whatsoever on anti-money laundering? I think this relates to laws or regulations for non-reporting entities, because there are those for reporting entities. And how can you kickstart this within that economy?
I think that's an excellent question. And I would say, let's say that there's a country with a non-existent money laundering law or a very weak law. You then have to begin to not only look at law enforcement, because law enforcement is extremely concerned about this, but look at the companies themselves. And there will be companies that recognize the problem and will be doing things. There'll be banks that'll be doing things proactive in the anti-money laundering, or there'll be other industries. The Chamber of Commerce can be very instrumental, because they know that their business is being impacted and the overall economy of the country is being impacted. So you want to work with the private sector on what's being done in many of these areas in the country. You will find institutions and organizations that want to do a good job, and they will be developing and adhering to best practices because they see it as inherently important to the survival and the progress of their institution. So I think you're going to have to look at the private sector if there's no strong anti-money laundering law. I'll give you that example again of correspondent banking. If a bank doesn't have a strong regime, then they're going to risk losing that correspondent banking relationship. So it's important to them to build capacity within their institution. But I think you're going to have to look at the private sector, where those people who recognize the need for it and what they're doing, let them lead the charge to have a strong regime, anti-money laundering regime.
Excellent. Well, we've done very well for time. We just have 5 more minutes to go. We don't have any more questions in the chat box, but if we could take one question, if there is one more question, and you would have to unmute yourself to ask the question. But we'll just start to wrap up now. We usually do this for about an hour. We sent out an invitation that indicated that we could go for an hour, 30 minutes. So we will go for an hour, for a little longer if there are more questions, but otherwise we'll start to wrap up now. Thank you so much, Jim. 2 things I want to say. One is the recording of the conference that you had at George Mason on trade-based money laundering. Pamela's just prompted that we at CIPE would really like to have that. It would be very useful knowledge resource for us, and I'm sure everyone on the call would also like to have that. So we'll certainly follow up with you and make sure everyone has access to it if it's okay to distribute.
Definitely. In fact, I think that the final report is going to be out soon, because I reviewed the draft, but I did want to make a suggestion. A lot of the material that we covered today we covered a lot of organizations, and we talked about typologies and red flags. I think if you in the audience want more information on this, we can get back to you with the sites on the internet that provide the details that you need. This was just a cursory overlay, so to speak, in terms of talking about this complex money laundering area. But if you want the specifics of kinds of typologies per industry, kinds of red flags, what organizations are providing assistance to countries, so you can go, if you're a member of the chamber, you can go to the government and say, hey, look, we can get these people in from the IMF and the World Bank, and they'll help us out. They'll train, etc. So, you know, we can probably, I think, if you send requests in, we can turn around and tell you what the internet site is specifically to provide the additional information. I think we can do this, Lola. What do you think?
Absolutely. So yeah, that would be, so two things we'll definitely follow up on would be collect all of this information, make it available to our network of compliance professionals. And I'm sure we will be following up with developing more materials for our compliance professionals to use in training their clients, but also in engaging law enforcement agencies. At least some of our partners are already doing that. So we will certainly make that available. Please, you know, feel free to reach out to us to ask for more specific information. But we'll follow up with Jim to make sure we get all of these resources out to everyone. Thank you so much for offering, Jim. That's really helpful. I think the other thing I was just going to follow up on, I think we have a second question. But the second thing I was going to follow up on is, and it's a really simple thing about what recommendation we would now have for compliance professionals in companies would be, if you have a corporate ethics policy and you have a system in place that's based on a corporate, you know, policy, you know, and procedural manual. One of the things that is fundamental now is that if the policy provides for a risk assessment, a corruption risk assessment, it should also provide for a money laundering risk assessment, because that's a completely different focus from what the corruption risk assessment would be. The money laundering risk assessment, you know, from what I'm learning now, would be tailored to the specific industry, the customer, potentially investors, and so it will certainly have a different methodology that from the one we apply for corruption risk, for the money laundering risk. And clearly, companies are exposed to money laundering, the risk of money laundering. So it does sound like, going back to Kathy's question, the first question we took, it does sound like that's one low-hanging fruit right there that we will recommend to businesses to incorporate in their corporate policies when it comes to mitigating risk. How does that sound, Jim, you know, from an expert point of view?
Yes, and also I know we have a lot of business people in the audience, and I think it's important for CIPE to sort of identify where there may be business opportunities. I think in providing anti-money laundering technical assistance in Africa is still a big business to be developed. I think whether it's accounting, internal auditing, training of people, development of computerized surveillance systems, there's a lot of opportunity out there for business. And it's quite frankly, if these businesses can be developed in Africa, it will be less expensive than having to go outside of Africa. And I know there are those companies are there. So there's opportunities there as a growth area for anti-money laundering.
Great. We have one more question. And if we don't have any more questions after this, that would be the last. There's interest in the anti-money laundering conference proceedings that you mentioned. We will make sure that's available. The other question is from John Mate, the chairman of the Kenya Chamber of Commerce, the Embu chapter. And John asks, what are the early indications of money laundering? What steps can I take if faced by money laundering? And this would be from the perspective of Chamber of Commerce, I believe. that's why John is asking.
Yeah, John, I think the best way to tackle this problem was, I think you'd have to rely on your membership in those particular areas to help you out here. Whether it's banks, insurance companies, money service businesses, casinos, you've got to rely on them input, maybe an informal group to get together and let them talk about what they recommend. So I think it's going to be difficult as a chamber person without working with their membership that can provide advice on what to do. I would look towards membership, have a small subgroup to work on what we see in this particular part of Africa. But to try to take it in-house is going to be difficult because, you know, we've been talking about a whole host of different money laundering schemes and covering 15 different kinds of companies and individuals. So that's, you know, that kind of knowledge is hard to come by. But I think individually, the industries and the chamber members, they may be very helpful in helping move forward, particularly if you want to move the government in a right direction of stronger anti-money laundering laws.
Great. There are no more questions, so we'll start to wrap up here. There's just one question I'll take the liberty of asking, because that's a follow-on from what you've just talked about for chambers. And this is as it relates to non-profit organizations like chambers of commerce, but also more like, you know, cause-driven NGOs. And I was reading an article where there was a comment by the former Minister of Finance and Vice President at the World Bank, Okonjo-Iweala, talking about how non-profit organizations in Africa can be used as a conduit for money laundering also. I don't know if that's something that has come up, if you've seen it a lot as a scheme that has been identified, but it would certainly be something that, you know, NPOs would want to be conscious of or aware of if, you know, if it's a high risk area too, because NPOs often, you know, could be organized by politically exposed people, but there's no way to say that, you know, to restrict PEPs from setting up NPOs. However, it's come up a lot about, you know, NPOs being used as a front for money laundering, but I've never seen a lot of you know, scrutiny or law enforcement in that area.
There's been Lola, there's been quite a bit written about it. When I was working in Africa about 10, 12 years ago, we discussed it, and someone brought to my attention that Africa has the largest number of NGOs in the world. And quite often NGOs get a bad rap, but there is a lot of material that's been written about the risks within NGOs and what is considered to be best practices for those NGOs. And we should try to get a handle on some of those research pieces, those papers, and get them out to the audience. I'm sure that it's out there. I've read a few things, but I think we could do a little survey and get something out to the audience just on money laundering and NGOs, best practices.
Yes, yes, excellent. Well, we would allow you, Jim, to close now. We don't have any more questions. We're not taking any more questions for now, but I'm sure we can impress upon Jim to share the materials that he talked about and probably answer a few more questions if you want to send them through to us. But now I think it's a good time for us to, you know, start to wrap up on this note. Jim, if you have any closing comments regarding all of what we've talked about in the questions that have been asked, we can, you know, we can go ahead and take that now and start to wrap up.
Just looking at some of the participants in the audience and hearing the questions, I think one of the questions devoted to what can be done. Well, the private sector can do a lot. to encourage stronger regulations and laws and the implementation of those laws. They can provide the pressure that's needed. And they can enlighten officials about the economic impacts, the negative impacts that money laundering is bringing to their countries. So the private sector can do quite a lot to pressure governments to design these strong anti-money laundering laws. So when institutions like banks and others around the world are considering investments or partnerships, that they'll look at that country and say, well, there's been progress there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yes, that speaks to something CIPE does very well, which is business collective action for reform. And so that's a territory that we're very comfortable working in, supporting our partners to push for these kinds of reform that creates more transparency and reduces the risk of corruption and corporate crime. So thank you so much, James.
It's a pleasure.
Yes, I'll just make a few announcements. And then we can close for today. But thank you everyone for joining us today. I very much enjoyed the conversation. I hope you all did too. When we sent out the reminder to the network, we were saying it's good to get away from talk about COVID-19 for a bit and cover some of the issues that we've been trying to get to on the compliance network for a while. So this I think this was a good breath of fresh air, and we're grateful to Jim for putting this together. We will make sure that all of the resources that was referred to today, we'll make sure they're available. We'll send them out by email. If you are not by any chance on our mailing list on the Africa team, please feel free to shoot me an email, or Laura or Michael, anyone on the team, and we'll make sure that you're on the mailing list so that you can have access to it. But we have the list of everyone who is on the call today, so we will just make sure that you have access to the materials that James has talked about today, and also to the recording. Just one quick announcement to the Africa Anti-Corruption Compliance Network. In the next 3 weeks, we will be working on new training material and resources. And there are 6 core topics that we're looking at. So we'll send out those topics to the platform by email and also to the WhatsApp platform. And what we would like to know is what you would like for us to prioritize. We will focus on the 3 that gets the highest votes and make sure those are available to you in the next 3 weeks. And you can use that in your trainings or your consulting sessions with business clients. With regards to the other initiatives that you might be contemplating as it relates to money laundering, with regards to how to work with the government or work with other stakeholders or get more resources or capacity building, we are happy to have that conversation with you. Just in case there would be value in applying for a grant from CIPE, I want to draw your attention to the grants that that CIPE will be given in the next few months. We've sent that out to the group as well. That on the WhatsApp group, that would also go out by email. Feel free to look at that and see if that's something you can apply for if you're thinking about initiatives that might fit that objective. And of course, if there are any questions, please feel free to reach out to us by email or by phone. But that's it. I hope if there are any questions about what I've just said, I'm available by phone or by email, or you can ask that now because we have just 1 minute to wrap up. But other than that, that's it. I don't think there are any questions. I don't see any. But feel free to email us if you do have any. And thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon or morning or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.